Good afternoon. My name is Emma Smith, and it is my honor today to get to introduce Rear Admiral Kibben, Chaplain of the United States Marine Corps and Deputy Chief of Navy Chaplains. A graduate of Goucher College, which was an all-women's college at the time of Chaplain Kibben's attendance, Chaplain Kibben appreciates the value and benefits of an all-women's education. This education, she argues, endorses, encourages, and supports not just women's education, but their professional development and unique perspective. Chaplain Kibben also comments that balancing career, military demands, and home life has both its challenges and its rewards. While the challenges speak for themselves, the reward is a very supportive husband, Tim, himself a career Marine officer, and a well-rounded, well-grounded 11th grade daughter, Lindsay. I have been told that Chaplain Kibben is remembered for delivering perhaps one of the most memorable talks of last year's Institute, and I am honored to get to introduce her today to you for what I expect will be a thought-provoking discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon. This is really very exciting, and several of you have sort of like halos around your head with that light coming through there. That's very encouraging, being a chaplain. I appreciate the fact that there are angels in the room. Seriously, I am really privileged to be here. They spoke about my visit being memorable. Well, it was to me. It was an incredibly wonderful opportunity to come up here and spend some time with the best and the brightest among Wellesley, with women who are coming from all sorts of different places across the globe, with an enthusiasm and an energy that is frankly contagious. So thank you for that. Thank you for giving me a great start to 2013, and I anticipate another great start to 2014. It really is a privilege to be here. Now, as part of the introduction, you heard her say that I also went to a women's college, and I did so for a number of reasons. Perhaps some of them were yours. One, it was small. Goucher at the time, I think we had probably 250 in my class. So it was a very small school, 1,000 total. And that was good for me. I like the intimacy, I like the comfort of close connections. But the other reason why is because I knew as a young adolescent that I really liked boys. And that I found myself not being myself when I was around boys. I hear some familiar laughter. And as a result, I knew that if I attended a school with boys, that I might be, well, distracted. So it made much more sense for me to come to a school where I could focus on what it is I needed to do. Besides which, you could come to class in sweatpants and nobody cared. So it is a privilege to be among those who get it, who understand that women's education makes a difference, frankly. And I was very disappointed, frankly, when Goucher went co-ed. They did so for certainly understandable reasons. It was financial. And the rest of us who are alums said, well, there's only so much we can give, sadly. But it's turned out to be a wonderful school, but it's not the same school I went to. So I hope that you are appreciating the time that you have here at Wellesley. It has a remarkable reputation, which I know you know. That's part of the reasons why you selected, I'm certain. It has wonderful outreach across the globe. Another great reason to be here at Wellesley, but I don't need to tell you why you're here. I probably need to tell you why I'm here. I'm here because I don't know because they have, those who put together this terrific month, realized that there is something different about people in uniform. And that there's oftentimes a large chasm between those who wear a uniform and those who don't. The chasm may be just a matter of mindset. Okay, it's often a matter of mindset, but it also may just be a matter of exposure. I shared with some folks earlier, my father, who was a sailor in World War II, who's still alive, by the way, stayed in the reserves for 20 years after the war, and my mother-in-law, who raised two boys, one who became a Marine, one who became a sailor, a naval officer, had never been to the Pentagon. And we were talking over Christmas, hey, how about we go see the Pentagon? And my dad said, I was hoping you'd never ask. I was afraid you'd never ask. Well, what do you mean? Why didn't you just say something? Well, I didn't know if we could. Well, I go to work at the Pentagon every day. It's like you going to your dorm room every day. It's your dorm room. You know, you don't think anybody has any interest in it but you and your roommate. And maybe your parents. But the Pentagon is like my dorm room. I practically probably spend as much time in the Pentagon as you do in your dorm room, but for me it's a place to go to work. It's not the Pentagon. And we took them around. The Pentagon's huge, by the way. You can't really see it in an hour or two. And my dad's 93, my mother-in-law's 83, so you certainly can't see it in more than an hour. But just the little bit we saw, they were overwhelmed, just overwhelmed. And both of them have history with military. Both of them have a connection with the military. It wasn't the military itself that was foreign. It was sort of the situation in which we find ourselves and where we work. Well, it finally dawned on me, you know, that's not so unusual for people who do not wear the uniform, who aren't working in the Pentagon. It's foreign. It's just different. If I were to ask you right now your thoughts on the Pentagon, I probably would not want to hear most of them. But just the fact that we don't know each other's worlds is the reason I'm here. And so I have a speech, and I'll share it. And we'll engage. I want to engage, so please make sure that that's part of your intention with me. I want to engage with you. I have a speech, but I am more than willing, and probably the most important reason I'm here is to have the dialogue so that we can bridge the gap, so that the chasm isn't quite so wide. Okay, fair enough? There's also another gap that I want to bridge. I told you already that I'm a chaplain. Well, I chattered one time in one speech I gave about being a chaplain and so forth and so on, and finally somebody had the nerve to raise their hand and say, what's a chaplain? And I'm thinking that there are a few folks in here who don't know what a chaplain is, and that's fine. What a chaplain is a professional religious leader assigned to the Navy or a hospital or some other institution where there's an expectation that spiritual welfare should be addressed. And I am a professional minister. I'm a Presbyterian ordained in the Presbyterian Church. I'm an ordained minister, and I'm assigned to the Navy to provide religious ministry. Now that means that I not only do the worship services and the scriptural studies, but what makes us different in the Navy and Army and the Air Force is that, and I'll explain the Marine Corps in a second, what makes us different in our role is that we also have a responsibility by virtue of Title X to facilitate for people of other faiths. So I already told you I'm Presbyterian. Well, there isn't a large percentage of Presbyterians in the Navy. There is, however, a wide variety of different faith groups across the military. And one of the things that we stand so firmly on in the United States is freedom of religion. So if I were Muslim, for instance, and I went into the Navy, how would I exercise my freedom of religion? How would that happen? Well, if I went to the chaplain and the chaplain is Presbyterian, how can she help me? Well, what I do when a Muslim or a Catholic or a Jewish or Baptist or anybody who isn't one of me, the expectation of me is to make sure I can facilitate for them. I either arrange for another chaplain who is of their faith group to come and provide worship services. I arrange a space where, for instance, a Muslim can say Juma, or I can arrange for a lay leader among other faith groups that they allow lay people to do some element of worship provision. I can provide transportation out in town. When we go overseas, I make connections with local clergy so that we can combine that. So that's what we do in terms of the religious aspect of what it is. I am not all things to all people. I cannot do Catholic Mass. I can't do a bat mitzvah. I can't do any of those things. But what I can do is make sure that those needs are addressed for our service members and their families. But the other thing that makes a chaplain unique is that we're wearing the uniform, if you will, of the institution. So if I were in a hospital, I may not be in scrubs, but I'd be in very comfortable shoes and I'd look like hospital staff, so that people understand that that's part of the institution's care for the patient. Likewise, for the military, I wear a uniform, I wear rank. in the institution, and so the institution has some expectations of me to function like every other member of the institution. I'm a naval officer, so I'm held to the same standards a naval officer is, whether it be weight and physical fitness, or whether it be understanding instructions and doing, all the things that are expected of a naval officer. But because I wear the uniform, people are more willing to relate to me. This title here says I'm also the chaplain of the Marine Corps, which actually occupies about 90% of my time. This is a perfect example. I stand before you today in a Navy uniform, but I usually wear a Marine uniform. Now, that's a little confusing to some people, but Marines don't have their own chaplains. Because Marines are part of the Department of the Navy, the Department of the Navy provides the chaplains from the Navy Chaplain Corps. So about 290 of our 900 chaplains are assigned to the Marine Corps. And when we wear their uniform. It's a permission we've been given. Marines are, a little bit jealous of their uniform, but they were gracious enough to allow us to wear the uniform, as long as we stay within standards. But when a Marine sees a Navy chaplain wearing a Navy uniform, we may or may not get any notice. But when they see a Navy chaplain wearing a Marine uniform, it's a totally different story. They understand it, they relate to it. We know that we have eaten, slept, breathed, endured all the same hardships that they have. And as a result, we make a connection. So as a Navy chaplain, and Chaplain Tavis Long is here with me, we, among all our other Navy chaplain brothers and sisters, spend time in units. We don't sit alone in our little office. We don't hang out in the chapel. We are in the unit. We deploy with them. That means we go on ships. We sleep in tents. We eat the same meals ready to eat, those god-awful little packaged foods. We endure combat, peacetime training, all sorts of things. So we've been through the same hardships, for the most part, that our other service members have, so that they can trust us and that we can provide and facilitate and care for them where they are in their place, okay? So that's what a chaplain does. Frankly, I think it's the best calling a person could have, for me anyway. It was a calling I received when I was in 11th grade, and I use that phrase. I realize that's a religious phrase, but it's very important to me. I believe that God set me aside to do this particular job, and it was very clear to me when I was just about entering my senior year in high school. And with that sort of divine appointment, I have felt very protected, guided, and directed into this particular vocation. Vocation, of course, coming from the word calling. All right, so that's what Navy chaplains do. So why am I here? I'm here, as I said already, to bridge the gap. And to bridge a gap that really is a superficial gap. I look out at you, and I remember vividly my time in college. And I think I should be sitting there. It was so much fun to be part of that community. I enjoyed my college experience most of the time, except right around finals. And I enjoyed it so much, and it become so much a part of who I am, that I really feel like I am you. And so in that regard, we're all in this together. We have set up some superficial barriers, partly because I'm wearing a uniform, partly because I'm older, partly because I now live in Virginia and not in Massachusetts, where it's really cold. Those barriers are really superficial. And what I'd like us to have this afternoon is a conversation. As I said, I have lots of lecture notes, but I really want to have a conversation. The conversation I want to have is about decision making, moral and ethical decision making. Because you, frankly, are leaders. You may not look at yourself as a leader right now. You say, "Oh, I'm a junior. I'm a senior. I'm not a leader." But you are. You have already taken a step into leadership just by virtue of being here, coming to Wellesley. There are women in your communities, wherever you come from, who say, "Oh, I can't do that. I can't do that. I'm not smart enough for that. I couldn't handle that." Am I right? But you took a step. You are already leading your pack, if you will. You're already taking a step into leadership just by virtue of making a decision to come to Wellesley. You're also leaders because you're here at the Albright Institute. You among, I don't know how many packages were brought forth, but of all the packages were brought forth, yours was selected. That means not only did you make a decision to apply, but people have acknowledged the fact that there's something about you that needs a little honing, in the best sense of the word. There's something about you that Wellesley sees as wanting to capture, shape, form, discover, so that you will have the tools that you need when you go forward beyond graduation. Once again, it's going forward into a position of leadership. You see, you may not even have thought of yourself as a leader, but I've already identified 2 areas in which you are already leading. I hope that gives you a little pause. Because that's what leadership is. You find yourself at the front and all of a sudden you go, holy crap, I'm up here. You know, and particularly as women, and maybe I'm overgeneralizing, particularly as women, I think that's a little awesome in the frightening sense of the word. It's a little, how did I get here? Should I be here? Is it okay for me to be here? What do people think about me being here? Am I going to do all right being here? I get it. But in this position of leadership, it's a matter, first and foremost, of owning it. You are a leader. You are someone people already look up to. Already look up to. So when you talk about CEOs of large corporations or you talk about admirals in the Navy, yeah, people look up to us. But people are already looking up to you. You are already leaders. So in that capacity, it's important that when you discover and own your sense of leadership, that you get also a sense of the framework, the groundwork on which you're standing, the foundation on which you're standing. Because a leader without a foundation will fall very easily. That's not a parable, but it sure sounds like a good one. So feel free to write that one down. But a leadership without a firm foundation will find him or herself falling very quickly. And if that foundation is not built on very strong principles, all the more fragile that position is. So this is where there's another gap. I look at your curriculum for the month, and I'm thinking, what do I have to offer to all these things that you're working on, those projects that you're working on in the various arenas? I fall into none of those categories. So whatever category you're in and you're thinking, aha, or it's probably more like, this is really the overarching element to every arena in which you find yourself. If you don't have a framework, a foundation on which you're standing, if that foundation is not based on good principles and isn't highly valued, then it doesn't matter what area of study you're in. So that's why I'm here, to talk about what that means, to talk about what it means to make those kinds of decisions. All right, so I've rattled on long enough. Now it's up to you. This is, in some ways, about ethics. But I have to tell you, I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn, and I'm not a professional ethicist. And so we're not going to talk about all those terms like ontological and teleological and deontological. I'm not into that. I'm not even sure how to spell them. However, I want to talk about some of the elements that are ethical elements that are part of a decision. So with that in mind, I'd like you to think about a situation. The situation is that you're driving. Now I say that and I realize some of you may not have your driver's license, okay? But if you don't, imagine that you do. Or imagine that you don't and you're still driving. Okay, so you're driving and you're coming up to a traffic light. And the traffic light turns yellow. All right, now with a show of hands, I would like to ask you to be honest, because I am a chaplain. You shouldn't lie to a chaplain. Okay, write that one down. And I want a show of hands. How many of you, I'm going to give you several choices. The traffic light is yellow. How many of you right then would slow to a stop? All right. How many of you would race through it? How many of you can't answer my question so far because it all depends on what's on the other side of the intersection, like a hot date or an important meeting? How many of you actually couldn't make a decision because you really are thinking about the impact, no pun intended, of running the yellow light, the impact on the traffic flow, the fact that there may be a car following too closely behind? You've actually taken a quick scan of everything around you before you made a decision whether you were going to stop or go. Okay? Every one of those questions, believe it or not, has an ethical foundation. And you're saying to yourself, what? It was a traffic light. What is ethical about a traffic light? But no, seriously, you stop and think about it. That was not a pun. Stop and think about it. Some of you believe that there are absolutes. It's either right or it's wrong. There is no in between. A yellow light means the traffic's going to stop, and therefore I must too. Right? Some of you have established your lives along those lines. Maybe it reflects itself in how you handle traffic lights. Maybe it doesn't. The traffic light's going to become more and more irrelevant to this discussion, just in case you're wondering. Others believe that the rules, you don't need to follow them. They don't apply to you. They're just for everybody else because you, after all, are careful. You know all the other situations. I don't need the rules. Rules are there for other people. Some of you take an in-between stance on decision making. It depends, right? It depends on the situation. What's happening on the other side? What am I getting to? How does it contribute to what I ultimately want to do in the future? Some of you make decisions based on the consequences. If I do this, i.e. the traffic light, if I run the traffic light, I could be hit. Or it could impact someone else, and they might be hit. Okay? So some of you make decisions based on the consequences of those decisions. You see where I'm going? And finally, for those of you who decided, I don't drive cars, I never have to worry about traffic lights. In my country, we don't have any anyway. This little discussion here has nothing to do with me. And so you essentially absent yourself from the discussion. Now remember, I said I'm not an ethicist. I'm not. I couldn't tell you which one of those was which one. But they are all ethical decisions. I started with the traffic light, but what I actually asked you to do is think about how you make a decision. Are you the kind of person who looks at things black and white? It's this or it's that. Are you the kind of person who says it's all about gray? Are you the kind of person who talks about how, all the other factors that are involved in making that decision, and so therefore you're hesitant to make a decision? Some of you think about the consequences. So when I open it up to larger questions, the same kind of thing applies. What if I talk to you about serving in the military in an all-volunteer force? We couldn't perhaps do the exact same exercise with right and wrong, but some of you, just by virtue of seeing me walk in the room in a uniform, said, that's right or that's wrong. By virtue of just who you are and how you make your immediate judgment on somebody walking in the room. That's right or that's wrong. Some of you said, I don't care. It doesn't make a difference to me. She's just one of those speakers. She's going to come in. She's going to chat us for a while. It's going to be long. It's going to be boring. And I hope I make it through the afternoon. That's how some of you are to think. It's depending on how it impacts you. Others, you have opened it up to say, I'm really kind of curious how this works. This is not part of my normal background, or I have some background in the military, and I want to see how this all applies. By virtue of what you thought as I walked in the room, you made an ethical decision. I'm stretching it a little bit, but what I'm after is the framework by which you make decisions. How do you make the decisions you make every day? Whether you're talking about traffic, whether you're talking about meeting someone else, or the decisions that you will make in your positions of leadership. and I'm going to knock over this plant by the time the lecture's over. Okay. There are how many women in this room? 40? There are at least 41, 42, 43, 44. There are at least 50 decisions or opinions in this room, at least. And our opinions are part of our decision making too. Our opinions are shaping the way we make decisions. They're informing the way we make decisions. We also need to take that into account. For instance, let's go back to our traffic light thing. In the United States, traffic lights mean something. In Afghanistan, they mean nothing. Or Naples, Italy. Or anywhere else you might have traveled. Traffic lights are a suggestion. So the whole ethical decision thing it doesn't have an impact. My point is that you are also being informed by your culture. You're being informed by the things that you grew up with. And if you don't stop to take, and what I'm asking you to do is take some time to think about how your culture is also informing your decision. When I walked into the room in uniform, your culture made a decision on uniform. One of the things about sailors is we love sea stories. And I'll tell you a sea story from a number of years ago. In the Bosnia conflict, we had military members coming into Bosnia. The conflict had died down for some time. And one of our chaplains had come off a ship and was in communication with the local priest and said, I'd like to bring some of our sailors and Marines to Mass, if that would be okay to you, to worship services. And the priest said, well, of course we'd love them to come to Mass, but tell them not to wear their uniforms. Well, we can't do that when we're deployed. You have to wear your uniforms. It's just one of those things. And there was great consternation on the local priest's part. Because, why? The community had had such a bad experience with people in uniform. People in uniform equaled rape, pillage, abuse. And so just that visceral response that people would have had to someone in uniform made a simple decision like, can I come to Mass, a huge cultural piece. As you look at where you've come from, and as you spend some time with each other and listening to where you each have come from, these are the kind of questions, these are the kind of information that you want to spend some time chewing on, finding out, listening for, being aware of as you think about how decisions are made. And in so doing, what you end up doing, I think, in the long run, is making a better decision. It may not have been a good idea to stop at that yellow light. It may not have been a good idea to stop at that yellow light because may have been several other factors in behind you. Literally, there may have been an ambulance behind you. Culturally, that may have created a much larger accident. There may have been a number of other elements. Your child was sick and you were running home, and if you didn't get there quickly. All these things, all these variables have to be considered as you think about making a decision. Bless you. We do that sort of naturally as chaplains. We do a lot of blessings, so feel free to sneeze. All right, so I've given you kind of what happens in decision making, the context of decision making. Now what I want to switch gears just a little bit, and I want you to be a little bit more active in our discussion about, or active in our, the process. Yes, give and take here too, but I want you to think about it more from an active perspective. Passively, you thought about a traffic light. It just sort of happens or it doesn't happen. But when you think about how you take this and move it forward, you're going to have to be a little bit more, you want to be more conscious about how you make a decision. So let me ask you, and you think I'm going to come up with something really esoteric, but I'm not, because I deal with sailors and Marines on a daily basis, and they don't even know how to spell esoteric. How many of you have a smartphone? All right. Last year, did I see anybody who did not have a smartphone? Okay. Got it. Do you have a cell phone? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Got it. Okay. How many use your smartphone or your cell phone just for making phone calls, just phone calls. Okay? How many, how many text? Use it for texting. Instagram, Facebook, FaceTime. Okay. Now, Snapchat. Now, how many of you know what a want ad is? Yes, okay. All right, so a want ad is kind of like a dial telephone. It's antiquated. No, seriously, a want ad is what the newspaper that actually comes on paper. I'm being pedantic, I'm sorry. But when you go, when I grew up and you wanted a job, you opened up the back of the newspaper, and the back of the newspaper was not just how to find a date. There was that too. But there were also job listings in the back. And so you would make the phone call to that one place and say, I'm interested in this job. I bring that up not just because I want to create a time distance here too, but I want to talk about how a want ad is a singular point of contact. It's one newspaper. You may or may not have bought that newspaper, and you have one phone call to make to one business who placed that one ad. It's a singular point of contact. Now juxtapose that with your Snapchat, with your Facebook, with your Instagram, with LinkedIn. Juxtapose that to today's culture where we are so connected that you couldn't even draw a network of the points of contact. Where we are today is that you have to be proactive in how you connect with people to get your name out there to get that job. And oh, by the way, people are looking back. People are looking at your Facebook page when you apply for a job. You've probably heard that before. It's not just LinkedIn. They're finding ways to look into Snapchat. Keep that in mind. But the whole job search has changed, the scenario of the job search has changed from a singular point of contact to a multifaceted point of contact. Stay with me here. I'm getting there in terms of how this comes out to decision making. There's a fellow by the name of Benjamin Coleman who said that strategic thinkers have to think beyond the first order. A want ad is first order, single point of contact. I read the newspaper, I see the ad, I circle it, I make the phone call, I go for the interview. Strategically, if I wanted a job, if you want a job, what do you do? Now let's do some dialogue. What do you do to try to get a job?
Do you mean today or when you'd have the want ad?
Today, you, Sarah Mahmood.
Okay,
Oh, that's right, we have to do the microphone thing, sorry. This gets a little harder to do.
I'd look on job search engines, or I'd look at LinkedIn and do some networking, contact Wellesley alums to see if there are any openings and old internships.
So just in that one answer, she listed off, she said 5 things, but from those 5 things came about, you can just see the spiraling that goes on from there. What else would you do to look for a job these days? Ma'am.
I guess this one might be similar to the want ad updated version, but I sign up for email listservs that send up regular, monthly updates to say these positions are opening.
Okay. Anybody else want to add anything?
I guess I'd just go to the place and ask if they have any openings.
Go to the place and ask if there are any openings? Pass it back to you, Rose. Oh, never mind. We've got one coming.
I'd ask my professors if they knew any places. That would be good for me.
Okay. Professors, you'd connect with people?
I was thinking about this recently, but with your application for a job that you've already identified you want to apply for, perhaps if it's appropriate, taking a creative approach to how you prepare your application to make your application stand out, but within guidelines.
Okay, great. So what you've done, just by listing off all you've said, is you've created a strategy. You were proactive in how you went about looking for, your decision is to make a job, to get a job, and to do so you used strategy. You used the environment. What's available to me? A professor is available to me. Alums are available to me. Listservs are available to me. LinkedIn. All that you made a strategy, whether you did so consciously or not, a strategy on how to go about establishing the context for your job search. So we're back to that word again, aren't we? Context. What you've done is you've created a better sense, a better awareness of everything that's going on around you. Would you apply for a job you knew you didn't want? You say yes? Why?
If you're thinking about a career or any sort of long-term, even if that means a few years, you might have to do a job that is not quite so interesting to you in order to get to one down the road or in the next step that might be more likable.
Okay, so it's a stepping stone. Okay, so you're creating a plan to get where you want to go. All right?
Because I need to pay rent on an apartment and they won't let me live in the dorms anymore.
Okay, so there's a pragmatic element to it. How about over here? Coming at you. There you go.
I think also when you're young, you may think you may not like something until you've tried it. Especially like when I was younger, certain foods I hated, and then I tried other foods and I was like, oh, this actually tastes good. So I think with a job, you can like see the blurb on the bottom of what it might say it is, but then when you actually interact with the people and other things, you may actually enjoy the atmosphere and what you actually have learned from it.
Great. So you actually expose yourself to things that you may enjoy or like without knowing it initially. Do you like Brussels sprouts, by the way?
I love Brussels sprouts.
Okay, see, there you go.
I know that something that other people do is apply to a bunch of jobs even though they don't want it, to increase the chance that they will actually get a job because it's unsure, and then also to get a better offer on compensation for a different job. So you can say, like, these 5 companies have offered me this, and I'm looking into it. However, I'd like your company best.
Excellent. Sure. Great. Every one of those is a strategy. You could apply for a job and interview for a job just because you need to improve your interview skills. Was that what you were going to say? You want it because, I don't know about you, I haven't interviewed for a job lately. And I'm not sure how I would do in that context. I know what I'm familiar with. When I was in college, I was familiar with college and how college people interact and how professors interact. But is business different? Are they after something else? Is this institution different? You know, so when I go looking for a job when I retire, you know, I want to get the practice. But see, what I've said is, what we've just done is, in this idea of decision making, what you did is create a strategy. I used a job search as a means of getting you to understand how to think critically about a goal, but how does one apply that when making a decision? You also want to think critically about making a decision, and you want to do so strategically. See? You want to be part of the solution. You want to be able to be, I got to back up here. You want to be able to think strategically about even decisions, especially decisions that are going to have some impact on the rest of your life, on the lives of people around you. The decision you make to get a job not only impacts you and your ability to pay the rent, it's going to impact your employer. And so the decision you make and the rationale you took to get to that job actually has some impact on the employer. What if you go under false premises? What if you're hired with they have an expectation of you and you formulated your interview technique to meet that expectation, but that was not where you were headed at all with either your gifts and skills? Right? You have impacted the employer. So in creating your strategy, it isn't all about you. It's about your future. It's about one step to the next step. It's about connections. It's about network. And it's about making sure that you understand the larger context. All right. So leaders who take the time to explore all the options. Leaders take time to explore different opinions. One of the values about this seminar, I'm certain of, is that, as I said, there are already 40 opinions right here in this room. And I'm sure that's not come to the fore at all in any of your discussions. The small groups that you're working in, I'm sure that all of you are of one accord and you're not having any difficulty connecting with each other at all. Right? Okay, remember that part about don't lie to a chaplain? Okay, that applies. When you are working on this project, you want to make sure you're listening to all opinions. You want to make sure you're listening to all perspectives. The value of this particular seminar, just by looking at you, I know that there are a variety of perspectives. Knowing how Wellesley works, I know that you're coming from very different perspectives. But there's a Wellesley mentality. And as you leave these hallowed halls and you go out into the world to lead, you're going to discover that not everybody thinks like a Wellesley student. It may come as a shock to you. I know, I'm teasing. But the point is, or maybe I'm not, the point is that as you go out into the world, you're going to discover that there are different perspectives, different opinions on different things. And they're counter-arguments to their decisions. If you listen to those counter-arguments, you will be able to make a better decision. Looking for a job you don't want helps you to determine what it is you do want. Listening to what an institution that you're not sure about helps you to understand, okay, I fit or I don't fit in. That was the answer that was up here. I may discover that I find something about myself that does connect. You've now opened your aperture to something else that you may not have known. Having somebody who comes in from the military to talk to people who've never even understood what a military is opens our aperture to and perspective on how things are decided. Leaders who take time to examine not only the first order effect of their decision, but the second and third order effects of their decision are more likely to make effective long-term decisions. A carefully thought out decision will be a long-lasting and better decision, is essentially what that's about. All right, let me bring you back again. You have an exam coming up. I'm just saying, you don't. Suppose you have an exam coming up, and you're debating whether to study or not. Are you going to bag studying for that next exam? Okay, so that's the question. So there are some steps I'd like you to take. We're no longer dealing with the traffic light. I'm not going to ask your opinions. Now I'm going to help you to decide whether or not you should bag studying for that exam. If you'd like me to ask the professors and the staff to leave, I will. But I want you to help. Just use this as an example. Will you bag studying for that exam? So the first step is to clarify what the issue is, to clarify the concern. Okay? What does it mean? Why would you want to bag studying for that exam? What's the big deal about this exam?
Just opportunity cost. Maybe there's something else that you would really rather do that you think is going to ultimately benefit you and make you happier than the grade you would get on the exam.
Exactly. That party down the street is way more beneficial than studying for that exam. Got it. Okay?
It may be the case that you're in a class or situation where either studying is not going to help you for the exam, or so some people argue about whether people should study for SATs or things like that. So maybe you're the type of person that doesn't need to study for the exam, or you may be retaking a class or familiar with the content already, so it's not a good use of one's time.
Okay, great. Okay, good. Yep, over here, and then there should be another microphone around here somewhere.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Okay, my answer would be maybe the exam just doesn't count for anything. It doesn't count for a grade.
Okay, doesn't count for a grade, all right?
I was just going to say maybe you're unmotivated because the subject doesn't interest you.
Okay, unmotivated, it doesn't interest you, all right? So go ahead.
It may be the case that you're actually physically ill and that you just value your health more than this grade.
Great, good. So you all have hit the gamut of what the impact, what the concern is about bagging the exam. You've talked about, I have other options, it's better for my health, I know the material, you've covered kind of the concerns. And those are also some of the assumptions that you're bringing into this. So you've clarified, the exam is tomorrow, that's the concern. The assumptions you bring into it are, I've got the material, I'm ill, all those other things that you laid out. I sort of combined 2 steps in one. Clarifying the concern, I have an exam. 2, the assumption is all these other elements that you raised. Now, let's think about it from another perspective. It's not you. Somebody else hears that you're thinking about bagging the exam. What are your friends, your parents, your professors? What would they say about this? What's their perspective on your bagging this exam? What little voices are going on in your head? It's on, I think.
Well, if it were from my parents' point of view, I think they would say, we're paying X amount of tuition for your Wellesley education, therefore you should study and learn as much as possible and make the best grades as possible, and studying would most likely lead to a better grade.
Okay, great.
I guess I would say it depends on the situation. I've had times when I was really sick, and even my parents were like, "It's okay, just sleep it. There's another test you can remake it with." But most of the time, parents would more likely say, "Study hard." And friends also, I think it depends on the situation. When they're like, "Oh, just come on for dinner or something," or they might say, "Stay back, and you should study for this."
Okay.
So, yeah.
Great. Anybody else? How about, when you think about what a professor, how about some of the staff? What would you say?
If you haven't studied by now, it's probably too late.
If you haven't studied by now, it's probably too late. That's excellent. Okay. You can see there's also a wide variety of perspectives on that too, which may not have been part of your initial assumptions. And then as you begin to kind of allow yourself to hear some of the other perspectives, it might change your mind. What are some of the other facts that might be involved? It may be the last test of the semester. It may be the one that your job depends on. It may be the one that establishes whether or not you're going to be part of the Albright Institute. It may not be any factor at all. It may be just a throwaway test. Those are facts, not assumptions, okay? It's things that you would want to know about the facts. It is tomorrow. It's at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I have all day. All those things are facts that you would want to bring into it. Identify the concern, your point of view, other people's point of view, and other facts. Now, what about the second and third order effects? Those are all first order effects. What about the second and third order effects of bagging this exam? Yes, ma'am.
The professor, you might need the professor to write a recommendation for you for something,
yes.
And they'll remember that grade.
Okay,
it'll
great.
make them think less.
That professor might be the one who's going to be the one who write your recommendation. That's excellent. Mm-hmm.
The mastery of that certain material might be really important for you somewhere down the line. If you don't study, then you're not going to master it.
Okay, great.
Well, in the test, having not studied, it might make you complacent and think that you can
There
do
you
really
go. Might
well
make
in
you
future
complacent
tests
later.
without studying.
Great, good, excellent.
Letting your parents down, but I also think if you serve as a role model for younger siblings and they hear about this, that might, affect how they perform in school.
Excellent.
If something changes and suddenly the grade system isn't what you thought it was going to be.
Uh-huh. That would be alarming. Okay, back there.
Your decisions affect your own self-identity and how you perceive yourself to be. So if you end up bagging an exam and then doing really poorly, that might affect your sense of confidence.
Wonderful.
Once you've bagged one exam, it's really easy to argue for bagging the next one.
Sure. It's kind of like murder, you know. Well, you know, I'm teasing. There are second and third order effects that impact murder. I mean, you could fail that exam or bag that exam and end up being a mass murderer. I am teasing now. But what I'm after is that when you initially thought about bagging that exam, when you initially came up with that discussion, there were some very short-range, myopic perspectives to that decision. The more you opened it up, the more you began to realize that there are other elements to that, other points of view that have value or no value. You may not care what your professor thinks. You may care very highly what your professor thinks. You may be thinking about, and then the second and third order effects. What happens if? And it goes on beyond that. So now my question is, are you going to bag the exam? Some of you are still saying it may depend. But translate that into a different decision of more importance. Translate that into things like a decision where you are at your place of work. Are you going to complete that task, or are you just going to let it slide? Are you going to fudge those numbers just to get out of the office real fast? Or are you going to spend some time and stay overtime? Are you going to? And you can name the decisions where you're going to have to say there's an immediate impact, first order effect, and then there are second and third order effects. There's my opinion, my assumptions, and other people's assumptions. And once I've weighed all those things together, then I will have a better sense of how that decision is made. I have used intentionally very trite, very pedestrian examples. I've been in some ways very flip, and I apologize if that came across wrong. But my point really is in saying those simple things are ways of examining pieces that have much larger import in your life. So let me tell you a story. And this is a Chaplain type story. I asked you to read the Bathsheba Syndrome before you came in here, am I right? And I'm not going to ask whether or not you've read it or not, or whether you bagged reading it for whatever other opportunity might have come up. Okay? But the story is simply this. It's a biblical story, and if you're not from the biblical tradition, consider it simply a story. And the story in the scriptures says, in the time when kings go off to war. Okay, that's a scene setter. Okay, in the time when kings go off to war. And there was a man by the name of King David. And he stayed home. King David, in the time when kings go off to war, stayed home. And when he was home, he looked across and he saw on the rooftop of the neighboring home a woman who was bathing. And he had a lust for her. And he went over and took her as his own wife. Okay, bad decision number one, right? So think about what that was. Short order effect, immediate gratification. I want this, I'm going to have it, right? So you can see how that sort of plays out into our scenario. All he thought about was my assumptions. I'm king, I can have it, she's part of my kingdom, she's mine. Okay? Bad decision number one. So then bad decision number two. After he finds out she's pregnant, because you know that always happens when you do something wrong, right? That's not entirely true. Some are lucky. But in this case, David is not so lucky, and Bathsheba ends up pregnant. So what does David do? He picks up his smartphone, calls to the front lines, and has Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, brought home. Oh, that's an interesting move. Why? Because he says, if Uriah spends time with his wife, everyone will assume that the child is his. Okay? Bad decision number two. Uriah, having a moral and ethical foundation that is well grounded, says, Everybody else is out on the front line. They're enduring hardships. Why should I be privileged to go home and be with my wife? And so he sleeps on the floor. He doesn't go in to his wife. He doesn't spend time with her. That's a good decision. David finds this out, sends Uriah back, and tells Uriah's boss, essentially, send him to the front line so that he may be killed. Bad decision number 3. If we went through every one of those pieces, what's the concern, what's the first order, what's the assumption, what are other people's assumptions, first order effects, second order, we could really unpack the story, but I think it sort of speaks for itself. I won't put you through that. My point is that it wasn't a simple bag and exam kind of question. This was a decision that would impact lives. It impacts the lives of Bathsheba, of Uriah, of Uriah's boss, who now knows about it or gets wind of it. The son that Bathsheba bears dies as a result of God's punishment. So now we've lost a completely innocent life. And oh, by the way, David is still king. We now have a ruler of a kingdom who has based his decisions on the myopic perspective that we talked about earlier. This is all about me. It's my gratification. It's my assumptions. I don't need to worry about any other assumptions out there. The first order effect is the most important thing. I don't see how this is going to impact anything else beyond me. The Bathsheba Syndrome speaks to that. You as leaders are going to be put in positions where you are going to be making decisions that impact other people. And our natural human inclination is to look out for me. Number 1. Our natural inclination is to say, this is how I see things. My perspective is the most important, if not the only. And that kind of thought is going to get us all into trouble. Initially, it may work. We may even be able to get away with it. Who knows? Maybe Uriah would have slept with his wife. David could have gotten away with it. But the thing about bad decisions like that, myopic decisions like that, is they tend to compound. You made a comment earlier that said, if I can do this now, I can do this again later. It's the same thing about bad decisions. They compound. And as you think about how you are living your life, as you think about how you take your careers and move them from the hallowed halls of Wellesley out into the real world, you are going to be asked to make decisions. And what I'm bringing to you this afternoon is a thought that says, think about how your decisions go beyond the immediate and expand into the real world. You can take it both ways. You can take it in terms of pragmatically, this is how a decision will impact people, and you want to make a good decision for the company. But I'm asking you to think at a moral and ethical perspective, to look at it from that groundwork, because any of those other more pragmatic decisions will be influenced by how you think morally and ethically. I am not telling you to go back to church, although that's not so bad. I'm not telling you to, but if you have a religious tradition, I guarantee you your religious tradition is helping you to make those decisions now. It's formulating the value structure. It's giving you a sense of other perspectives. It's giving you a sense of the second and third order effects just by virtue of that view. I'm asking you in this company to recognize that people in this room not only have different opinions, but they have different values. To explore the values that each of you have. Why do you make the decisions you make? To spend some time as you're working on your projects to say, how did you come to that brought you to this piece? So that you can understand not only the thought process, but the value process. That not only helps you to understand where they're coming from, but it helps you to better get a sense of where you're coming from. When I first went off to seminary, which is the graduate school for ministers, when I went off to seminary, I had this perspective on life, theological perspective. When I went into seminary, even though it was a Presbyterian seminary, you'd be surprised the gamut of experiences out there. But it helped me to become a better Presbyterian. It helped me to have a better articulate what I felt and what I believe. What I'm asking you to do when you make a decision is to recognize that every decision has a moral and ethical element to it. I started you with the traffic light. I'm bringing you now to life decisions, life and death decisions, and everything in between has a moral and ethical element to it. Now, what the Bathsheba Syndrome story does not tell you about is another person. That person is a guy by the name of Nathan. Nathan was, I'd like to say, David's chaplain. Nathan was a man in the institution who advised David on a number of things. When Nathan heard what David had done, Nathan came to David, shared with him an allegory, and essentially said, you know, there once was a man who owned hundreds of sheep. He saw a shepherd who had one sheep who was precious to him, almost as if it were a child. The shepherd with many sheep stole the sheep from the man who owned that one sheep. David was horrified. Nathan looks at David and says, "You're the man. You did that. You stole that man's wife, the one thing that was precious to him." Now, that's a pretty powerful statement. And in and of itself, it speaks an awful lot of words. But what I want to share with you is that Nathan had access to the king. Nathan was, in fact, privileged enough to have that kind of rapport with the king. As a chaplain, I have that kind of rapport with decision makers at the highest level. I have the ability to talk to them about very personal things, about big decisions, to help them to understand what their moral and ethical framework on which they're building that decision. What I'm asking you to do is to find your Nathan. Who is your Nathan? Who advises you? Who knows you so well? Who understands what you value? Who understands what your purpose is? You may not be king. Oh, wait, I don't think that'll happen in here. You may not be king, but there are expectations on you. On the day when kings go off to war, are you staying home? And who would talk to you about that? Who would hold you accountable? That could be a number of people. It could be your classmate, your best friend. It's the person who's going to pull you aside and say to you, "You know what, Mara? We need to talk." It's the person who knows you so well and knows that you are, in fact, not only destroying yourself, but other people around you, and that the decision you make is going to have implications well beyond the immediate gratification. Find your Nathan. But that Nathan has to also be grounded in a strong moral and ethical framework. Don't just pick anyone. Find somebody whose values are exceptional. It could be a pastor. It could be an imam. It could be a priest. It could be your parents. It could be a professor. Find somebody that helps you make good decisions. So that's where I am. Maybe you didn't expect that from a Navy chaplain. You may not have thought that's what I was going to bring to you when I walked into this room. But what I do hope that's happened is that whatever gap there was when I first walked in, I hope it's bridged a little bit. And I want to be able to spend some time with you in the next 25 minutes or so, and I want to chat with you. Really, the sky's the limit. This is your opportunity. I'm game for any question you want to throw out there, and I realize I just threw the gauntlet out big time. I'm game for any question. I may be less inclined to tell you like how much I weigh, but I'm very happy to talk to you about any of these things or anything beyond. But what I want to leave you with is this. Wherever you are, recognize your role as a leader in this community, in your community, and throughout the world. You're a leader who cannot stand alone. You must have supporting systems. You must have a foundation, and that foundation must be grounded in the most pure and valuable morals and ethics that you can be aware of. So that's where I am. The floor is yours. Okay, now don't be shy. Please.
I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you for sharing that with us. Something that your talk reminded me of is we have little siblings and big siblings at Wellesley, and my little sister and I had a conversation about intrinsic versus extrinsic self-worth, and we both realized that part of our problem with dealing with academic stress and shaping how we make decisions is that we were putting our self-worth in our external achievements and not in the personal characters traits that we have and in our relationships with other people.
Great.
And I was wondering what your role is in helping the leaders that you advise to do that. And I was wondering if you could touch on that some more and how you might go about doing that, getting these people to realize what is making them good people instead of externalities that are always changing. Because I think that's a big problem at Wellesley. Like, I think it might be a problem other people have too.
That's a brilliant statement. That's a brilliant statement and a very keen observation. So I walk in here with all this stuff, right? And in our world, this stuff means something. So does this stuff. And it's pretty heady. In fact, it's way cool. You know, it's way cool being an admiral. And it can really get to your head. But I'll tell you, the woman I meet in the mirror every morning is not this. And it's the raw truth. And as old as she gets in the morning, that I have to recognize that that's me too. And that internal value is not what I'm wearing or the job that I hold. It's internal. And I think that's I almost want to make sure I write that down later so that I can include that in another conversation. But I think that's probably the hardest thing for us as humans to do. We do crave external value, extrinsic value. We crave it. We love to be complimented, you know. And maybe, and I won't generalize, but I think women prefer it. Probably, but no, I won't say that, because I hear both men and women want compliments. They want affirmation that they have done something right or that they are okay externally. But it's a matter of kind of getting a feel for, it's a matter of breaking through whatever barrier it is that keeps you from believing it. And in my role as chaplain, I think Chaplain Long would say the same thing. We meet people at the most vulnerable situations. We meet people either in hardship, you know, when we're deployed and so forth, and people are really down at the lowest points of their lives. We meet them at crisis, at death, at divorce, at really very desperate moments in their lives, when what they're really looking for is they would do away with anything extrinsic just to have their own sense of value and purpose back. We have that entree just by virtue of the fact that that's what we, you know, that's why we're there. We're there to help people to be human. From my perspective as a chaplain, there's a matter of understanding how the soul plays into that and our spiritual value, our spiritual well-being, and help people to tap into the divine extrinsic value, if you will, that helps us to understand better our inward intrinsic value. For us, for me, I think as humans, and I apologize if this comes across like a sermon, but for me as a human, I don't think we will ever find our intrinsic value on our own. We won't, because we're prone to do all sorts of crazy things just by virtue of being human. But as I help people understand their value in a larger context, in a divine and spiritual context, or even if not divine and spiritual, within a community context and the value they bring in, the better they understand the value that they have and offer. So,
thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for being here today. I had a question about in the Marine, and I'm sure the Navy, this comes across a lot with having people who are above you and having to respond to what they tell you to do.
Mm-hmm.
How do you reconcile that with your own internal morals? So if you're told to do something that you may not agree with, but you kind of have to follow through with it because they're above you.
Sure. So when somebody who's senior to me orders me to do something that I don't agree with, okay, they're fairly simple things. I mean, your parents tell you to clean your room, okay? And you know in your heart it's the right thing to do, and even though you don't want to do it, you do it. But then there are other decisions that or orders that if they are immoral or unethical, we have a right, it's built within the system, for us not to follow that order. If it is an unlawful order, we don't have to follow it. Now, there's a lot of that, there's a lot of stuff in between that. And it's a matter of how one understands how that order is being communicated, what the situation is. Depending on the situation, you might go a different route. Somebody who's perhaps between you and that senior person, you might actually go above that senior person. You speak to the senior person first if there's no reconciliation there. And that's one of the things that they promote. If you've told me to do something, Sarah, that I don't agree with, you're my boss, and I don't agree with it, I'm supposed to go to you first and have that conversation. Now, that takes an awful lot of guts to do, a lot of internal strength to go to Sarah and say, not because you're a bad person, but as my boss, you have a lot of sway over me, a lot of control. You can impact, talk about second and third order effects. However, that's part of our culture, is to confront. However, if Sarah remains belligerent and I know it's immoral, then I can go to the next level up and say, I've confronted her about this. This is what the outcome was. And I give someone else, it's essentially an appeal to make a different decision. Diana?
Hi, thank you for being here today. I had a question about Nathan. My initial impression from your talk is that Nathan and being a leader are two separate entities. But do you believe that, a leader can be a Nathan to somebody else, or that Nathan can be a leader himself?
Great call. Great comment. And you are absolutely right. Nathan was a leader. In my perspective, he was a spiritual leader. But he was definitely, as an advisor, he had an element of leadership too. Sometimes the leader, we equate leadership with the guy on top. But I also think that everybody who plays into that scenario has an element of leadership as well. And it's a personal responsibility. So you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I'm going to take that on board and use that a slightly different way. Absolutely, thank you. And I'll come back over here.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. My question is more about your role as a chaplain. You mentioned that you also facilitate other people of other religions to practice or worship their God, but at the same time, there's a preaching element in ministry. Then how do you balance preaching your own religion as well as facilitating others? And I think this applies to leadership too. How do you convince other people of your ideas, but at the same time respect them, or even lift up their ideas as well?
Great.
Thank you.
And the first half of your question in terms of the actual act of preaching, that's an easy question. We have a chapel. If I'm holding a chapel service, everybody knows I'm coming from my theological perspective. And if they don't want to come to my chapel service, they don't have to. But in my facilitation, I ensure that they can. So in that regard, there's no conflict. But your point's well taken in terms of leadership. If I believe a certain way and I want to put the institution in a certain direction, how do I do that while still respecting the perspectives of other people, especially if those perspectives are grounded in very core beliefs, in core values that may be different from my own? And that's very challenging, and I think part of that has to do with what we were talking about before, and that is to get the discussion going. You've got to be able to hear where people come from. If you are in a position of leadership and ultimately the decision is yours, part of that process is not only do you listen, but you make sure that people understand that you have heard where they're coming from, and even based on that, this is the decision in which you feel that you need to go. But you also have to be ready to explain why you came to that conclusion. And the leadership material will tell you, all the references that are out there will tell you that good leadership is one that listens, that dialogues, but ultimately when the decision is made, helps people to understand that they either contributed to it by helping to formulate that decision, or contributed to it by helping to test that decision. And so it isn't a matter of simply saying, I believe this and everybody, everyone else be quiet. It's a matter of saying, I've come to this. Tell me where you think I'm wrong. Tell me where you're coming from. How would you have made this decision? Allowing that discussion. And then, okay, I've heard what you've said. I've weighed out all the options. I believe this is the right course to go. I chose this over this because, and thank you for helping me to firm up that decision. So, yes. Oh, there's one behind you.
So in the Bathsheba story, Nathan is someone who has the privilege of being near the leader.
Yes.
But as technology progresses, those boundaries between people and the leader break down. So what do you think about the people, the public, becoming the leader's Nathan?
Wow. Okay, so I'm talking through it not just so that you can hear, but so that I can figure out where to go with this. With technology essentially isolating the leadership. Did I get that right? Or at least...
actually making it so that the people are able to judge and give their opinions of the leader's actions.
Okay. So, for instance, a president and media sort of formulates the opinion. That's an interesting perspective, because the public speaks. I mean, there's a public voice that needs to be heard too, and the public has its own values and moral and ethical framework. From a group think perspective, we all the public has created its own moral and ethical framework. You can see that especially as you go from one country to another. One country will value something over another, whereas the United States would value something perhaps differently. And so the public does have a voice in that, but that's a real challenge, because in that case if the people create the decision, then the people have become the leaders. And if the people have not opened themselves up to that dialogue, to the Nathans, to the critical thinking, if the people have closed themselves off, then they are no better than a King David who closed himself off. So I think we, as citizens of our country, as individual citizens of our country, need to recognize here's a new word for you, Nathanic role, our role as Nathans to the public in their sort of mass leadership. And that our voices, should they be different, should they be based on values that are more pure than the public, we have a role as individual citizens to speak up to that public.
Thank you very much.
Let's go back to you. I don't think you've asked one yet.
So thank you for being here today. My name is Laura Bruno. My older brother serves in the Marine Corps, and he graduated from the United States Naval Academy. So throughout my years at Wellesley, we've had very interesting discussions about the unique cultures that each of us have experienced. And based on those cultures, sort of how we were discussing a lot about sort of the external factors that contribute to our decision-making, and how that eventually contributes to what we define as success in very unique ways, I believe. So in our world, in our Wellesley realm, success is one thing, whereas in his world, success is a very different thing. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you could speak to how, sort of in relation to our reading, how success obviously led, in some senses,
it can lead to the negative aspects
Yes.
that we saw
Mhm,
in David's
mhm.
story. And my impression is that it's sort of a system of checks and balances between Nathan's and David's in the
Mhm.
world. In your specific position, who is your Nathan?
Great. Well, he's one of them sitting right back there. And I joke, but that's true. And that kind of goes back to what your question was. In a position of leadership, I have personal accountability to my husband, my daughter. They certainly keep me honest and humble. But I also have, and Tavis can correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things when I make a decision, or as I'm making a decision, I want to make sure I know how it's going to play in Peoria. I want to have a better feel for how it's going to be received, what the elements to it are. How am I getting so caught up in my job that I'm missing the point that really how it's going to impact people beyond me, how that's going to. I listen for that and I encourage that kind of dialogue. My personal Nathan. That's a great question, and as personal a question as that is, it's convicting. It's convicting enough to say, I'm not really sure. Other than my pastor and the way, and now you're getting kind of Margaret Kibben's theological perspective. Other than my pastor and how God interprets himself through the Holy Spirit to me through my reading of Scripture, God is essentially my Nathan. But that is also left open to personal filters, and I'm aware of that as well. So personally, it's on my own spiritual journey. Professionally, it's the people I work with in my office. I like to think I've created an environment that's open enough that they can come in and say, what are you thinking? The emperor has no clothes, essentially. I think I've created an environment where people are willing to do that. But even saying that, and this where it's slightly different in the military, I know I'm open to that. But I've got all this stuff on, and people are afraid of the stuff. And they may not realize there's a Margaret Kibben in here who wants to make the right decision. They see an Admiral Kibben, they see the deputy chief of chaplains, and it's the position that frightens them. And they fail to speak to the person. So that might be something you also want to think about. As you're taking on positions, people are going to view you in that position, the extrinsic stuff, and they won't be able to speak to you as who you are. And you have to give people permission to speak to you as you are. I really want to invite that kind of feedback. Please.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I've been thinking a lot about means and ends. One of our speakers a few days ago was talking about how infrastructure is often seen as an end, but can be a means to some other end, like human flourishing. And in my opinion, some of the most difficult decisions that we have to make is when the means and the ends conflict.
Yeah.
So perhaps the U.S. fights a war
Sure.
for a specific end, such as democracy or freedom. However, the means to get to that end can go against our moral compass, involve the killing of human beings, things like that. I was wondering if you could offer any insights as to how do you make a decision when you feel like the means to an end goal that is, following your moral compass is in a different direction.
Well, that's why we have chaplains. That is job security, is what that is. We never know. We never know. And I think at best, we do the best we can with what we have. As long as we have opened ourselves to have whatever we can, to understand how what the means are, and whether in fact does justify the ends. All the more reason for the dialogue. I am all about diplomacy. Okay? The nice thing about being a chaplain is that I'm a non-combatant. I don't carry a weapon. I'm not allowed to carry a weapon. I don't want to carry a weapon. Frankly, I would have nothing to do with war. But I am here because there are real human beings who are making those decisions. And I would much rather be in and with and engage those people who are wrestling with all of that so that they can listen to the questions, they can listen to the perspectives, they can have every piece of information they need, physical, pragmatic, theological, spiritual, moral. I want them to have every piece of information that they can, and with that information, do the best they can with what they have. That's an incredible question, and one I don't know that I can really answer. And except to say, thank God that we have a military in this case, and in other cases where you're making those decisions, that we have the ability to open that aperture as wide as we can and engage in the discourse, engage in the dialogue, to allow diplomacy to work when it can. And that we have the checks and balances, whoever mentioned that earlier, we have the checks and balances even within our own government to make those decisions. But none of those means will do anything toward the end if we are not in communication with each other, if we're not engaged in this dialogue, if we're not talking to each other. As long as that chasm exists between the diplomats and the military, the executive power, and anybody and any of these elements of our attempt to get to an end, as long as those chasms exist, we will never make a good decision, and it doesn't matter how close to the ends we get. Did you have one?
So thank you for your presentation, especially finding our own Nathan can also be relevant, I find, in our day-to-day mundane decisions. But bringing it back to the Albright, where everyone is very diverse, and also global leaders who are very different in their perspectives and may have different Nathans to refer to, what is your take on how these global leaders and potentially us during the Albright session reconcile our own Nathans to come to various decisions that we have to make in global critical decisions?
Okay, so how do you take 40 women and get them to talk together and get along? Question for the ages. I think, you have it. You do. I mean, I see it in your eyes. I see it in your enthusiasm. You have it. You don't need me to tell you this. I'll tell you what I think. And what I think is that the more open you are, the more engaged you become, the more you're willing to respect, and forgive me for not using that word more often. You've got to respect the fact that there are 40 women in here with 40 different perspectives. The respect is really what it starts with. I may not agree with you, but I better respect you. And in respecting you, then you feel valued. Now we're back. I mean, this sort of what ties everything together, doesn't it? If I value you and you recognize that I have valued and heard you, even if my decision ends up to be something different, even if I don't change my mind, we have agreed to disagree. And in that agreement, we can still get along. It's when we begin to hold grudges, it's when we begin to close off those lines of communication, it's when we begin to put judgment in there, and judgment leads to disrespect, that's when we're going to lose it. So I would ask you, in your groups, in the large group, in the individual encounters, start with respect. Respect is an element of love, oh, by the way. But start with, and that might be a little hard to handle, but start with respect. The value that each one of you has. Every one of you has value. No one is valued more than the other. Every one of you has value. And if you respect where that comes from, then you can proceed to agree or to agree to disagree.